Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of a few things that I've read recently that are very political or heavy on the social commentary, and I didn't intend for them to all have those thematic similarities, but that's just the way it worked out. So first up, the comic. This is Hellblazer, The Best Version of You, which is the final collection in Spurrier's run on Hellblazer. This, of course, is the ongoing DC/Vertigo comic series about the street detective who deals with, when the series is going well, really uncomfortable situations. When it's not going so well, it leans towards more of a magic focus. But when it is at its best, it's more of a horror book. In this particular run, Spurrier is basically taking on metaphors for growing ethno-nationalism and populism in England. And the book succeeds in being uncomfortable, but most of the time I didn't actually feel like it was as well thought out as it could have been. So while this definitely worked as horror, as social commentary, which it was very clearly and explicitly trying to be, I thought it was a little bit on the lazy side and could have had the potential to do something much stronger, but it did seem to be kind of heavy-handed in bits. Working class fisherman meets a mermaid and gets her to murder French people. A lot of it just was too obvious, and I wish there'd been a little more nuance to it. Now visually, and in terms of the general ideas, it is still uncomfortable in the way that I like for Hellblazer. So I was left a little uncertain as to how I wanted to rate this, because it does succeed as horror, but when it's clearly trying to do social commentary and is very explicit about that, I think it's fair to judge it on the lack of nuance there. I appreciated the try, and I liked that this is really tonally more a return to the classic Vertigo era of Hellblazer as opposed to some of the versions of this character that we've seen in the meantime, but it was a book where I was left wishing that it had gone just this one extra step and played with some less obvious metaphors. I think still worth picking up, especially if you are a fan of the book purely as a horror book. I mean, it has had social commentary basically all the way along, so I think it's not the wrong way to look at it, to judge it that way, but solid art. If you're looking for an uncomfortable Hellblazer, yeah, that is one. Next up is the other work of horror that I read, and that is The Corpse Exhibition. This is written by Hassan Blasim and translated by Jonathan Wright. These are a series of short stories, all of which are set in Iraq, and all of which deal with a lot of body horror in general. There are some stories that are a bit supernatural, there are some stories that are, here are some psychopaths, there are some stories that play with a mixture of them, but they do all almost flip the expectation in that I think if you were reading short stories with a realistic war setting, you kind of expect a layer of horror because it is a war setting. And what this does is make it a horror setting that happens to be set in a war zone, and I thought a lot of this worked really well when taken on its own. Every time I read more than one of these stories back to back, they sort of blend together, and it does feel like it's just a lot of gore. And I'm not generally a fan of artificially dragging out a book, but I did find that if I was reading one story in the morning and one in the evening, or just one a day, I was enjoying those individual stories far more than when I read more than one at a time. When I finally finished this, I did read the last 3 stories all together, and I came away thinking, oh, that wasn't as satisfying as the rest. And I think that is 100% because I read them all together. Now, I mean, I think there's an argument to be made that if this were stronger, it would stand on its own regardless of whether you read it straight through or not, and I think that's a fair criticism. But I did feel when I was reading these one at a time, they did work. But overall, I was satisfied is a weird thing to say, but it was a satisfying read. If you are turned off by things like body horror and graphic violence, don't pick this up though, because there's a lot of that in here. Also, Iraq was one of the countries last month for the Invisible Cities project, so this is, I was gonna say on trend, that's not on topic for that. Alright, now we can get into the opposite side of that, which is horror, because it's war. I briefly mentioned this book in my discussion video the other day. This is Semezdin Mehmedinović's Sarajevo Blues, which is a collection of short prose and poetry that he wrote during the early days of the siege of Sarajevo in the early 90s. This was translated by Ammiel Alcalay, who I'm going to talk about some of his own work later. who has really interesting ideas about translation as activism. And there are notes from him in this as well, which are fantastic. This collection of poetry and short prose bits is kind of fascinating in that I read a lot of war memoirs and a lot of war histories, and I didn't expect this to be as challenging of a read as it was, and I think because it was written in the early days of the war, and because we know so much more about this conflict now than he did at the time that he was writing this, every now and then you just kind of sit the book down and think, this is getting worse, and he doesn't realize that yet. And I mean, he talks about conversations in here with his son, and some of it's kind of humorous, where he's saying, like, Haroon, come in, it's grenading out. And it's meant humorously, but you do go, ah. And I didn't expect it to be as, depressing is not even the right word. It does almost make you feel despair at the state of humanity, because I'm reading this from the future. I know that he and his son made it through the war. I'm not worried about them as I'm reading his poetry and his thoughts of the day. But you do think about it from the perspective of, in that moment. I think often we see diaries from non-professional writers come out of conflicts, and that's different because he was a professional writer and poet before that, and some of the big Serb war criminals were also poets. So some of the bits in here are people who we didn't necessarily know were war criminals. You might have just thought they were a general on the other side, but at the time, we know better now. And he'll talk about interactions that he had with them at writers' conferences in Yugoslavia when it was before the war. And there's just this kind of dread over it, because again, we know how those people turned out. And so when he's horrified that this poet whose children's books he owned is, you know, saying how he wants to kill all of them, we know that it's going to be even worse than what he's speculating about at that point. Not necessarily for him, because he's in the city where at least it was more of a traditional war, but you think about what happened in Eastern Bosnia, and like, it's fascinating to read this just from that perspective. Stylistically, it's very modern, which is either is or isn't to your taste, but I think even aside from the style, it's interesting just because of the bit of history that it captures. If there's a flaw in this, I would say it is that the translator doesn't include the original alongside the translations, which is always something I would like to see in poetry. With the prose bits, I would never expect that, and because it's bits of both, maybe it's too much to, that's maybe a reason not to have done it. But I did find myself wondering what choice is the translator making in a few places and what is actually coming through from the original. But that is a minor complaint in the overall scheme of things, because that was very interesting. Next up, I have a book that is by an author who I have read his translations before, but I haven't read his own work. This is Fugitive Atlas by Khaled Mattawa. He is a Libyan-American poet who does a lot of work translating modern poetry from Arabic into English. This is a larger collection of work that has been collected in other places. Elaine from Books by Lanes did a review a while ago of Mare Nostrum, which is another collection of his poetry, which actually includes the middle section of this. So I will link to her review below. She had slightly different issues than the issues that I had with this, although I also had issues with the perspective that he takes in some of this. There are sets of short poetry in here that is trying to mimic a traditional form of Bedouin poetry, but bringing it through to English, and that is really interesting just stylistically. I very much appreciated that. I enjoyed the poems in here that are reflections on things that happened in his own life. I enjoyed the play with perspective and then the play with style in some of this. There is a section in the middle where he is talking about things like the refugee crisis, where he does write from a variety of perspectives, because in a lot of that poetry there wasn't really anything stylistically interesting about it, so you are looking at the message more than the style. So there is also a long poem in here that deals with American veterans of the invasion of Iraq who became disfigured as a result of being injured during the conflict, and then Iraqi children who were born with disfigurements as a result of some of the bombings. And I was hugely uncomfortable with the tone that he takes with that, because on the one hand, I think it is possible to talk about disability and disfigurement that is the result of a military conflict without presenting characters within the poem that are stand-ins for actual people, which he acknowledges in the notes, in a sense of horror. I think if you are looking to actual people, live people, and using their bodies as body horror, I think that is appalling, especially if you are trying to present it in a way that I guess you would call politically progressive. If you are treating actual people's bodies as something horrific, as opposed to something horrific has been done to these people, if you can't make that distinction, and he very much does not make that distinction, and I was just appalled by the fact that that was the angle he was taking with that, because these children are still children. Their bodies are not a symbol for you, and if you are using it that way and you are not them, and you are also not this American veteran who has had his face burned off, the framing of that was awful. And so even though I enjoyed a lot of that poetry, just the perspective that he was taking on disability and disfigurement was just appalling, and like, don't do that. People are people. People are not symbols. And you can say that something awful has happened to people without saying, look how awful they look. Ah. So I really loathed Finally, that. I have another book that is also playing with politics, but in a much more experimental way. And this is Ammiel Alcalay's From the Warring Factions. And this is the translator who worked on Sarajevo Blues. And this is a lengthy piece of primarily found poetry and kind of erasure poetry, where he takes segments of other works of journalism, of long-form poets, and puts it together into something that is kind of alluding to the massacre at Srebrenica, but doesn't actually refer to it until the final page. I thought this was incredibly successful in pointing out how general conflicts and massacres can be to humanity, and this kind of false moral equivalence that gets put on so many different conflicts, which is the excuse that then various powers use to not get involved in things and to sit by while real horrors are happening. Really stylistically interesting. There are frequently pages where there are blocks from a report, or where there are just a couple of words or phrases. It is very, if you are not a fan of experimental types of poetry, I probably wouldn't recommend this to you, although I think there's an interview with the author in the back that I think is still worth picking up, but this is very definitely something that if you don't like experimental and very modern poetry, you are probably not going to enjoy this, although I think if that is your thing, this is incredibly powerful. Because two of these collections of poetry were by people who are also translators, and because the other collection and then also the short story collection were translated works, I did want to read a part from the interview that the author does at the end, because he's very big on translation as activism, but also for writers to be aware of the world. And of course the issue is, for monolingual people especially, if you don't have access to other parts of the world, how do you know what you're missing? And he makes the comment, for a writer not to know and read and engage in several other languages seems to me to be like a musician playing only one note, or a painter who has decided to just use blue crayons. And then he goes through and he mentions the languages that he reads in, and essentially says it's not enough. But this is his comment on monolingual consciousness that I thought was really interesting. Most of all, a monolingual consciousness allows cultural and governmental commissars to assume and promote limited perspectives and be secure in knowing that there is little basis for deeply rooted social and cultural resistance, especially to lies and stereotypes. This is internalized. It is also reproduced socially across the body politic, from the campaign against terrorism to a special on foreign presses I recently saw in the magazine Poets and Writers, in which the section on Israel featured only white Ashkenazis. The same journalists and editors would have been outraged to see a feature on New York or Los Angeles that did not mention African Americans, Asians, or Latinos. But in Israel, they didn't know what to look for, or more importantly, didn't know what they weren't being shown. While so many students are out there doing hyper-theoretical work on a limited number of texts, we still don't have a map. People need to go back and do a kind of sociolinguistic and cultural atlas of what has taken place and continues to take place. It would be revealing and might dislodge assumptions about who and what we are or claim to be. It would also be easier to see things. So Alcalay is particularly interested in the way the kind of American ideology determines what gets translated from the former Yugoslavia and from Israel and Palestine. He is of Sephardic and Baghdadi Jewish heritage, and his parents were from Serbia, so these are all languages that he speaks. And his particular interest is in that area, but as you go through the rest of this, he does talk about how this applies to the entire world. This is not just about the Balkans and the Middle East. This is a global issue in which if you only have a few people determining this is what can be translated from somewhere, that's what they're also doing is determining this is the only viewpoint you're going to get from this, which is really interesting. And as I said, even if you're not into experimental poetry, I think it is worth reading that just to have that piece, because his perspective on that is very, I think, refreshing, because I think there's an attitude around translation that presents it in more literary terms as opposed to political terms. As you'll often see people comment that, oh, only literary fiction gets translated except from the Scandinavian languages or something, which is not 100% true, but there are more layers to that. Definitely something worth considering. So anyway, that is some of my oddly interconnected reading from the past couple of weeks. If you read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought. I'm going to be buddy reading a different collection of Khaled Mattawa's poetry with Courtney Ferreter later this month, so we'll see how that goes. And I also recently picked up Semezdin Mehmedinović's most recently translated novel, so I'm looking forward to revisiting both of those authors shortly. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.